The off-world labor queue at the Dunlow River intake hall was 40 bodies long, and Maren Holt could already tell which 3 were hers by the way they held their papers. You learn to read a queue the way you learn to read a load chart. The nervous ones gripped their documents two-handed against their chests, as if the laminate might be confiscated by wind. The veterans folded theirs into a jacket pocket and watched the room. The liars held them loosely, casually, a little too low, performing the ease they didn't feel. The tall one in the gray work coat held as like he had never carried anything for himself in his life. Maren shifted her clipboard to her hip and watched him over the rail of the waiting pen. He was Veirish, oxide red skin with darker banding along the jaw and throat, black eyes ringed in thin gold, a head taller than the customs officers and trying hard not to be. The other 2 on her hire sheet were easy to place. A squat Atran female with rigger's calluses you could see from across the hall, and a human kid from the southern arcologies with a welder's tan. Workers, the Veirish was the problem. His coat was new, his boots were new. His hands, when he passed his documents through the slot, were the smoothest hands she had ever seen on a man claiming 6 years of station labor. Venn, the customs officer, read off the laminate, Harry Venn, hull laborer, 3rd grade, out of Tessin Ring Station. A pause that went on too long. This says you worked the breakdown gangs on Tessin for 6 years. That's correct, the Veirish said. His standard was perfect. That was the second wrong thing. Breakdown gangs spoke a standard chewed down to the bolts, drop the articles, drop the courtesy, keep the verbs. His came out whole and unhurried, every word set down like cutlery. Tessin Ring logged a hull breach in its labor ring 4 years back. Big one. Where were you? Maren saw it then. A flicker, 1/2 second where the casual grip on nothing tightened on nothing. Section 9, he said. We lost the gang 2 compartments over. I carried a man named Halu to the pressure doors and he died anyway. I would rather not describe it further, if the record doesn't require it. The officer looked at him a long moment. Somewhere down the hall, a stamp came down on someone else's life twice, like a heartbeat. Then the officer's screen chimed, the Tessin registry confirming whatever it confirmed. 400 light years of bureaucracy vouching for a man whose boots had never touched a deck plate, and the laminate slid back through the slot with a green chit clipped to it. Next, Maren wrote a small letter L next to the name Ari Venn on her sheet in her own shorthand. In the corner where the foreman's office never looked, L for liar. It wasn't a judgment. Half the off-worlders who came through Dunlow were running from something: debts, wars, families, gods. The works didn't pay enough to deserve the truth. The L just meant, watch where you put him until you know what he's lying about. She had no way of knowing that morning that the answer was a throne. The 3 hires came through the pen gate with their kit bags, and she gave them the speech she gave every intake flat and fast before they'd even set the bags down. I'm Holt, shift supervisor, Hollis Bridge and Crane Works, which is the only reason any of you got visas, so don't make me regret the paperwork. We build and refit heavy lift cranes, bridge steel, and barge hulls. The river will kill you in March, and the steel will kill you in any month it likes. You do what your gang lead says, you flag what you don't know, and you never ever walk under a suspended load. I don't care if it's been hanging there since the founding of the company. Questions? The Atran grunted no. The kid shook his head. The Veirish raised one hand, courteous as a schoolboy, and the gold rings of his eyes caught the hall light. What happens? He asked. If a man flags that he doesn't know anything at all? The Atran snorted. The kid grinned at his boots. Maren looked up the long way at the new hire with the soft hands and the green-stamped lie, and something in her, the tired, load-bearing part that had held up the works through 3 owners and 2 recessions, registered him properly for the first time. Not the strangeness, the honesty inside the dishonesty. It was the only true thing anyone had said in the hall all morning. Then I put him where knowing nothing can't drop 40 tons on my crew, she said. Paint gang, let's move. The works sat a mile downriver from the intake hall, on a bend of the Ketteridge, where the water ran brown and patient under 4 generations of crane rail. There had been 900 men and women on the rolls when Maren's grandmother ran a lathe there. There were 206 now, counting the 3 walking behind her. And whether there would be 206 in the spring depended on a contract decision being made in a glass tower very far away by people who had never stood under the gantries and felt the whole sky of steel humming in a wind. She gave the new hires the yard tour at her walking pace, which the kid kept easily, the Atran kept grimly, and the Veirish kept the way a long-legged wading bird keeps pace with ducks, effortlessly, while looking like he was studying how walking was done. Fabrication sheds 1 through 4, she said, pointing. Gantry line, outfitting basin. That ugly brick pile is the old pattern shop. Stay out. The floor's condemned. Mold loft. Clinic blue door, and you go for anything bigger than a splinter. I've buried men who were too proud to get a cut looked at. She stopped at the foot of the number 2 gantry crane and let them feel the size of it. The legs going up 190 feet, the rail span wide enough to straddle a barge hull, the whole green-painted skeleton of it streaked with 80 years of rust bleeding through 80 years of paint. And this is Greta. She lifts more than the other 3 cranes put together. The man who can keep Greta happy will always have work in this yard. The man who gets casual with her will be a closed casket service, Vin. Supervisor? Nobody at the works called her supervisor. They called her Holt or boss or hey, she let it go. You're with the paint gang on the south fence till I say otherwise. Mirek runs it. He'll hate you for a week on principle. Wear the respirator even if the humans don't. Because my kind are more sensitive to the solvents. Because the humans are idiots, she said. And the Atran laughed for the first time, a sound like gravel going down a chute, and they were a crew after that, more or less the way it always happened. Not in any ceremony, just in the first shared joke at somebody's expense. That should have been the whole of it. 3 hires, 1 liar, a yard that needed bodies badly enough not to ask questions. Marin went back up to the shift office, filed the intake forms, and spent the afternoon on the thing that actually frightened her, which was a letter from Consolidated Meridian Logistics, the parent company's parent company, announcing that representatives would be visiting Hollis Bridge and Crane in the autumn to assess capacity ahead of the award of the Tide Gate contract. The Tide Gate contract was the construction of 4 storm surge barrier gates for the Aldermouth Estuary, the largest moving steel structures ever commissioned on the continent. Whoever won it had a decade of work. Whoever lost it had a yard full of cranes in silence. There were 2 bidders left. The other was Karsk Maritime, 300 miles north, newer, half-automated, beloved of every analyst who had never watched a weld fail. Marin read the letter 3 times, put it in the drawer where she kept things that could end the world, and went back out into the noise. If anyone had told her that the strange new Heir painting the south fence was the second heir of the Vayrish Accord, that the customs queue at Dunlow that morning had processed, between a refrigeration tech and an asylum case, a man whose face was stamped on coins on 40 worlds, she would have laughed once without humor and told them to wear the respirator because the solvents were clearly getting through. He painted fences for 9 days. She knew because Mirek, who ran the paint gang like a man hurting insults, came up to the shift office on the 9th day, took his cap off, which he did roughly annually, and said, "The big red one, Ven, what did he do?" "Nothing, that's the thing." Mirek turned the cap in his hands. "First day, he paints like a man who's never held a brush. I mean, never, Holt. He loaded it like a soup spoon. I let the gang laugh. Figure he quits by Thursday. Second day, he paints like the manual. Third day, he paints like me. Yesterday, I find him doing the lattice truss on the fence corner, the part everybody botches, the part I always redo myself, and it's done right. Better than right. And when I ask him where he learned it overnight, he says, Myrek's face did something complicated. He says, you taught me. Myrek, I watched your wrist. 9 days, he learns what took me 9 years. Either Tessin Ring grows geniuses or he's never worked a day in his life and he's learning everything for the first time, Marin said, fast as a man falling learns about the ground. Myrek looked at her. You knew, I suspected. She pulled the roster. You want him off the gang? I want him promoted. Off my gang before he learns my whole trade and they make him run it. It was as close to a compliment as Myrek had come in living memory. Put him with the riggers. A man who watches that well, you want him watching loads. So on the 10th day, Marin walked the south fence line at lunch to tell Ari Ven he was being moved up, and found him sitting on an overturned paint bucket with his back to the river, eating the worst lunch she had ever seen a grown male assemble. Plain bread, a whole raw onion, and a carton of milk with the contentment of a man at a banquet. Supervisor, he said, and started to rise. Sit, who sold you that lunch? The shop by the bridge. The proprietor asked what I wanted, and I confess I panicked. The onion was prominently displayed. I gathered it was popular. It's displayed because nobody buys it. She sat on the stacked rail ties across from him because her feet hurt and because, she admitted it to herself later, much later, because he was the only person in the yard who didn't need anything from her, and she had forgotten what that felt like. You're off the paint gang Monday. Rigging crew. It's more money and more ways to die. Damal runs it. She's the Atran who came through intake with you. She made lead in 9 days, which tells you we're short-handed, not that we're sentimental. He absorbed that with a small nod, and then he did the things she would think about that night against her will. He looked at the fence, at his own 9 days of paint, silver gray and dead straight along 400 feet of riverbank, with an expression she had only ever seen on apprentices at the end of their first real job. Pride with no place to put itself. Pride that had never been allowed out in public before. I will miss the fence, he said with complete sincerity, and Marin Holt, who had not laughed at work since the spring layoffs, laughed. You're a strange man, Ven. You have no idea, Supervisor. Holt. Nobody calls me Supervisor. Holt. He said the name carefully, like he was setting down cutlery again, and then with the same care, if a man wanted to learn what a load chart actually means, not to recite it, to understand it, who in this yard would he ask? The river ran brown and patient behind him. Somewhere up the line, Greta's hoist motors sang their two-note song, lifting something heavy into the wind. Marin looked at the alien on the paint bucket, the gold-ringed eyes that watched everything like the world was a risk to be learned, and heard herself say, "Me," he'd ask me. Tuesdays after shift. Bring a better lunch. Walking back up the line, she told herself it was succession planning. The yard was short-handed. The man learned faster than anyone she'd ever trained. It was, she told herself, exactly what a supervisor was for. She did not yet know about the ship that had brought him. A sovereign-class courier with its transponder dark, parked out past the orbital line under a merchant flag, with a crew of forsworn retainers aboard, all of them in quiet despair. She did not know about the message torn up on its deck, the one addressed to the sovereign matriarch of the Vairish Accord, the one that had said only, "I will not be sold to end your war. I am going to find out what I am worth without the crown. Do not look for me." She did not know that the smoothest hands she had ever seen on a laborer had, 11 weeks earlier, signed away their place at a betrothal table between two empires, or that the customs queue at Dunlow had been chosen off a list of 10,000 entry ports precisely because nothing important had ever happened there. All she knew was that he showed up on Tuesday with 2 lunches from the shop by the bridge, both correct, both clearly assembled under the proprietor's pitying supervision, and a used copy of the Regional Rigging Certification Manual, already annotated in a hand so fine it looked engraved. "Page 41 is wrong," he said by way of greeting. "The sling angle table. The loads are calculated for symmetric lifts, but the diagram shows an asymmetric one. A man who trusted the page would overload his left leg by a fifth." Marin took the manual, checked the table against 20 years of doing it right by feel, and found that the strange new hire from the queue was correct. The book that certified every rigger on the river had a wrong page, and nobody had caught it, because the ones who knew didn't read and the ones who read didn't know. "Sit down, Ven," she said. "We'll start with what the book can't tell you." It became Tuesdays, and then it became Tuesdays and Thursdays. And by the time the leaves turned on the Ketteridge, it had become most days at lunch, the two of them on the rail ties by the south fence with load charts and shop drawings between them, and Marin teaching the way her grandmother had taught her, "Here is the steel. Here is the wind. Here is the arithmetic that keeps them from meeting your crew," to the only student she'd ever had who treated a sling angle like scripture. He was, by October, the best rigger on the river. Demal said it flatly, the way Atran said everything. "He sees the load path before the load moves. I've worked steel 30 years. I see it when it moves. He sees it before. Where does a fence painter learn that?" "Tessenring," Marin said. Demal looked at her with both sets of eyelids, which was Atran for "We both know that's a lie, and I notice we're both fine with it," and went back to work. Because here was the thing about the lie, the thing Marin had stopped being able to ignore. Whatever Ari Ven was lying about, he was not lying. To take. Every liar she'd ever processed through that queue had been lying to get something. A wage, a visa, a head start on whoever was chasing them. Ven lied like a man trying to give something up. He took the worst shifts without being asked. He stood his round at the Anchor Tavern on payday and drank 1 beer slowly, like he was learning beer. He gave his overtime to Pavic, whose daughter needed surgery, by losing to him at cards so consistently and so plausibly that it took Marin a month to spot the arithmetic of it. The man could calculate a load path through a crosswind, but somehow always drew to a dead hand on payday. She spotted it because she was watching him. She was watching him because, and this took longer to admit than the L on the intake sheet, somewhere, between the Onion and October, between page 41 and the two-note song of Greta's hoists, Marin Holt had begun looking forward to lunch like the green apprentices looked forward to Friday. He asked her questions no one had asked her in 15 years, not, "Can we make the deadline?" Questions like, why did she stay when Karsk had tried to hire her twice at twice the wage? What did the yard sound like in her grandmother's day? When the wind came up the river in March and the whole gantry line sang, did she hear it as a warning or a choir? "Both," she'd said, surprised into honesty. "That's the job, hearing both." He'd nodded slowly, gold-ringed eyes on the gantries, and said quietly, "Where I come from, they only teach you to hear the choir. There are people paid to hear the warnings for you. It makes you." He searched for the word with that terrible care of his decorative. "And where is that, where you come from?" A long pause, the river running brown and patient. "Tessenring," he said at last, and the lie sat between them on the rail ties like a third lunch nobody would touch. And Marin let it sit, because the alternative was asking a question whose answer might take Tuesdays away. The first time the lie nearly died, it was the 14th of October, and it nearly took him with it. They were swinging a 60-ton box girder off the barge basin in a wind that had come up faster than the forecast. The Ketteridge doing what the Ketteridge did, funneling the weather into a blade. Marin had the lift on hold twice and let it go the third time because the window was real, and the girder had to land before the tide turned, and it was a good call, it was the right call, and it would have stayed the right call if a 40-year-old shackle on the tagline hadn't chosen that exact gust to give up the way old steel gives up, all at once, after a lifetime of warning nobody. The tagline snapped back across the basin apron like the wrath of God. The girder slewed. 60 tons of box steel came around in a flat, lazy, unstoppable arc toward the apron where Pavic, slow, kind, indebted Pavic, stood frozen with the deadline in his hands, doing the thing that killed riggers, which was trying to understand the last 2 seconds instead of living the next one. Marin was 100 feet away. She had time to begin a shout. Ven came from the basin edge. Later, replaying it the way you replay the bad ones, frame by frame at 3 in the morning, she would understand that the thing that frightened her wasn't his speed, although no one in the yard had ever seen anything on 2 legs move like that. It was that he moved on the load path, the exact line. Before the girder finished choosing its arc, he was already where it would be, because he'd seen it before it moved, and he took Pavic in both arms and turned, putting his own back to the steel, and the girder's end caught him across the shoulders and threw them both 20 feet into the gravel margin. And the whole yard's noise stopped at once, the way it only stopped for the dead. He was not dead. He was sitting up before Marin reached them, with Pavic alive and swearing in the cage of his arms, and he said in that unhurried cutlery voice, with 80 feet of crane shadow swinging over him, "The shackle was from the old stock, Holt. I flagged the old stock in September. The paperwork is on your desk." Then he fainted. The clinic behind the blue door was one room, one nurse practitioner named O.C., and one rule, which was that O.C.'s word beat everyone's, including God's. Marin stood in the doorway. She told herself a supervisor belonged at the scene of a lost time injury, which was true, and she told herself that was why her hands wouldn't steady, which was not, while O.C. cut the work coat off Ari Ven's shoulders and went very quiet. The bruising came up almost black across the oxide red of his back in a band as wide as the girder's flange. That was expected. That was physics. What was not expected was what the portable scanner said about what lay under it, and O.C., who had treated Varish dockhands in 2 ports for 9 years before Dunlo, looked at the readout for a long time. "Boss," O.C. said at last, neutrally, "step out a moment." Outside the blue door under the October sky, O.C. held the scanner where Marin could see the screen. "I know Varish baseline. Cortical bone density, the strut pattern of it, there's lattices, like bridge truss, you'd like it. This man's lattice is reinforced along every load line, not natural variation, engineered. Prenatal, the good kind, the kind that costs more than this yard. There are maybe 3 places in the Accord that do that work, and none of them have ever done it for a Hull laborer's family." O.C. lowered the scanner. Also, his left shoulder was dislocated, and he set it himself in the gravel before anyone reached him without changing expression. "I've seen soldiers do that. I've never seen a rigger do that. What are you telling me?" "I'm telling you the man on my table is wearing a body that was built for him by people with the kind of money that has armies, and his intake file says breakdown gangs, Tessin rings, 6 years. O.C.'s voice stayed level. "My duty's to the patient, and the patient's not in danger. Bruising, a cracked process, nothing his lattice won't shrug off in 3 weeks, which itself, by the way, is impossible. What goes in the incident report is your call. The report goes to the insurer. The insurer's system talks to the registry. The registry talks to whoever is listening for this man's bones, and somebody somewhere is listening for this man's bones. People don't carry skeletons like that around unmissed." The wind came up the river and the gantry line sang, and Marin heard it the way she told him she heard it. Both, warning and choir, both at once. "Write the bruising," she said. "Write the shackle. The scan's a clinic record, not an incident record. It stays behind the blue door." O.C. held her gaze for exactly long enough to establish that this was being done knowingly by both of them as adults. 3 weeks light duty, O.C. said, and went back inside. Marin stood in the yard a moment with her own heart, which was conducting itself unprofessionally. Then she went in after. He was sitting up on the table, refastening what was left of his coat, and there was something in his face she'd never seen there. Not pain. He wore pain like weather, but fear. Quiet, contained, well-bred fear, watching her come in, watching the scanner on its hook by the door. "What did it see?" he asked. "Bruising," Marin said. "A cracked process. A shackle that should have been scrapped in September, which is on me, because your flag's been on my desk under the Meridian letter for 5 weeks. She picked up his green chit and his battered intake laminate from the tray by the door, looked at Ari Venn, hull laborer, 3rd grade, and set them back down. Light duty, 3 weeks. You'll do it in the rigging loft. Inspections, paperwork, you'll hate it. He watched her, gold rings steady around all that black. That isn't what I asked, Holt. I know what you asked. She stood with the table between them, with the river going brown and patient outside the little window, with 15 years of being the one who heard the warnings and made the second most reckless decision of her life, the first being still some months off. And here's the only answer you're getting. In the spring, you flagged the old stock. Today, you put your back where my crew's lives were. Whatever your bones cost whoever's listening for them, in this yard, the only thing your body's done is exactly what it should. So my paperwork says bruising. And my question, her voice did something she hadn't authorized, dropped low, came out steadier than she felt. My question can wait until you want to answer it. But then, when the day comes that whoever you're hiding from walks up that road, and they always walk up the road, son, I've worked this river my whole life and they always come. You will not let my crew stand in front of it without knowing what it is. That's the price of the bruising. Do you understand me? For a moment, the man on the table looked at her like she was something he'd read about, like she was a wrong page in a book he'd trusted, corrected at last. Then he did something with his right fist against the center of his chest, a small, precise motion, clearly involuntary, clearly drilled into him before he could walk, pressed it there and bowed his head, the way no one anywhere bows to a shift supervisor. On my line and my name, he said quietly, they will not. Neither of them mentioned that his name, by his own account, was a green chit with a lie clipped to it. The vow stood anyway. It was the realest thing in the room. Pavic told the yard, of course. Within a shift, the story had grown a foot and lost a second of reaction time, and within a week, Ari Venn could not pay for his own beer at the Anchor on a Friday, which solved at least the problem of him learning beer too slowly. Demal began calling him the Cathedral, for reasons she refused to explain to humans, and Mirek, who hated everyone, was heard at the tavern saying that he'd taught the big red one everything he knew, which by Myrick's grammar was adoption. And Marin found that the yard had quietly redrawn its map of the two of them. No one said anything, no one had to. When the lunch whistle went and Venn carried 2 correct lunches toward the rail ties by the south fence, the crew's eyes followed him with a benevolence so total it was worse than mockery. And when the autumn dance came around at the Union Hall, string lights, bad speakers, the whole town smelling of frost and fried dough, Demal materialized at Marin's shoulder and said, with gravel tact, you should bring the Cathedral, before some other yard does. She didn't bring him. He came anyway in a clean shirt, with the studied air of a man attending his first union dance after a lifetime of, what? She watched him stand at the edge of the floor with a paper cup of cider, watching the dancing the way he'd watched Myrek's wrist, learning it, and she knew with sudden, embarrassing certainty that if she let him learn long enough, he would cross the floor and ask her, correctly, carefully, and that she would say yes, and that the whole yard would see exactly what it would see. So she met him at the cider table instead like a coward, and they talked about sling angles while the band played, and walked back along the river afterward, the lights of the works strung out on the black water like a harbor of small stars. At her gate he stopped and said, Holt, the question that's waiting. The frost made his breath visible. Even his breath looked careful. I want you to know the shape of what it is, even if I can't give you its name. There was an arrangement, made about me, around me, before I was old enough to refuse it. The arrangement would have me spend the rest of my life as a signature that ends a war, seals an alliance, secures a line. Decorative, Holt. The most decorative object in 3 systems. The gold rings were very bright in the dark. Everyone I have ever known looked at me and saw the signature. I came here, to this river, to your queue, to a fence that needed painting, to find out whether there was anything underneath it. Whether, if you take away the thing everyone wants from me, anything is left that anyone would. He stopped. The river ran. Somewhere downstream a bell buoy knocked, patient as the water. That anyone would want, he finished, in a voice she'd never heard from him, the careful cutlery all gone. And he looked at her like the question was hers to answer. She was 41 years old. She had buried her father, held a yard together with her hands, and been proposed to twice by men who'd wanted the version of her that could fix things. She knew exactly what was being asked and exactly what it cost to ask it, and she reached up and put her palm flat against the new coat over the old bruise, lightly, the way you check a weld you already trust. There's a whole man underneath, she said. I watched him learn a fence. Good night, Venn. She was through the gate before she let her face do what it wanted. Behind her, in the dark by the river, the second heir of the Vayrish Accord stood holding his own chest like a man checking that his heart was still where he'd left it, and the lie they were both keeping wintered over, warm, like a seed. Winter tested everything on the Ketteridge every year on a schedule the river kept to itself. That winter it ran its tests early and graded hard. The first test wore a good suit. In December, a recruiter from Karsk Maritime took a room at the Anchor for a week. They did this every other year, trawling the river towns for talent, and usually left with a couple of welders and the town's lasting resentment. And this time the recruiter asked, by name on the second day, for Ari Venn. Word reached Marin before the man had finished his first coffee, because yards know everything. She made herself stay in the shift office. It took most of the morning. Venn told her about it at lunch on the rail ties in the cold, with their breath standing between them like a third party taking minutes. He offered me lead rigger on the automated line. Double the wage, relocation paid, a signing bonus he wrote on a napkin in case the table was listening. He turned the napkin's memory over with the same care he gave a wrong page. He said something interesting, Holt. He said, at Karsk, the machines do the judging, so nobody asked where a man came from. He thought it was a selling point. He'd read me partly. He could see I was a man with a back trail, so the offer was more money and no eyes. And I have spent my whole life in places where nobody's eyes did the judging, he said. Rooms full of people looking at me and seeing a document, the only thing of value anyone has ever given me. He looked out at the brown water, and his voice did the careful thing it did when it was carrying maximum load, is a corner of an intake sheet with an honest mark on it. He offered me no eyes, Marin. I'm here for the eyes. It was the first time he'd used her name. She let it stand, didn't correct it to Holt, which told him what it told him, and the minutes of the meeting, had their breath truly been taking any, would have recorded that the negotiation concluded there, that day on the rail ties, 11 weeks before either party said anything out loud. The second test came in February, and it came the way the river's real tests always came, at night and weather with the whole town watching. A hard freeze had locked the Ketteridge for 3 weeks, and then a warm front came through like a rumor of spring, and the ice broke all at once upstream and came down on the thaw flood in rafts the size of barges. By midnight the rafts had jammed against the piers of the Dunlow road bridge, the old bridge, the only crossing for 30 miles, the one with the hospital on the far side, and the jam built itself into a dam, and the river, patient no longer, began to climb its own banks toward the low streets where the pensioners lived. The county had a plan for ice jams. The plan assumed equipment that was 2 budget cycles away from existing. What Dunlow actually had at midnight in freezing spray was the works, and the works had Greta's little sister, the floating derrick barge, and it had Marin Holt standing on the flooded Quay Road with the fire chief and the county engineer, both of them shouting over the grind of the ice, both of them looking at her. The textbook answer was explosives, and the textbook was wrong twice. No licensed blaster within 6 hours, and the bridge piers were 1920s masonry that would take the shock worse than the ice would. The river gave them perhaps 2 hours of arithmetic before the low streets went under. Boss. Venn was at her shoulder in streaming oilskins, with the rigging crew behind him. Nobody had called them. The yard had simply emptied itself onto the quay the way it had emptied itself for the gray ship, except this time it came carrying slings. Ask me what I see. Tell me. The jam isn't one load. Everyone's looking at it like one load. That's why every plan is too big. It's a bridle of loads, locked against each other, and locked things have a key member. There, his arm, dead level in the floodlight glare, the water sheeting off it. The raft against the second pier, the one standing at an angle, it's not resting, it's strutting. It carries the whole jam's thrust into the pier. Lift it, not blast it, not break it. Lift it, 4 points, gently. The way we set the truss down at the demonstration, run in reverse, and the jam loses its keystone and unlocks itself in sections. The river does the rest of the work. Rivers always do the rest of the work. The county engineer said it was impossible to rig a floating derrick onto moving ice at night. The fire chief asked how many men it put on the ice. Venn said 1. It has to be 1. The ice will carry 1, and was already buckling the harness, and Marin stood on the flooded Quay Road with the cold closing around her boots and did the thing that supervisors are actually paid for, the thing no load chart covers. She weighed the man against the town with no time, in bad light, and signed. Demal runs the derrick. Venn goes out on the wire, son. You stay made fast to that hook if the saints themselves ask you to unclip. Chief, get your people moving the low streets anyway. The river doesn't read our plans. He went out across the grinding rafts in the floodlights, a tall, careful figure walking on a surface that was trying to become water, and set 4 slings on the strutting raft like a man setting cutlery, and the derrick took the strain in increments. Dimmel feathering the winch by feel in the dark in the spray, and at 7 minutes past 2 in the morning the keystone raft came free, gently, like a tooth that had decided to cooperate, and the Ketteridge unlocked itself with the sound the town talked about for years. A long, rolling, grinding exhalation, the river letting go of its own held breath, rafts shouldering past the piers and away downstream into the dark. The flood crest dropped 4 feet in 40 minutes. The low streets stayed streets. The bridge stands now. They came off the water ice to the eyebrows, and the town was on the quay by then, pensioners and publicans and the night shift of everything, and somebody started the kind of cheer that has soup at the end of it. Venn unclipped from the hook and stood there in the floodlights with the ice. In his banding, looking at several hundred humans cheering for a rigger, with an expression Marin was the only one positioned to read. Lost. Entirely. Helplessly lost. A man who had been trained from birth for the adulation of crowds, who had stood on balconies above plazas of millions, undone completely by a fishing town cheering a competent lift. She handed him soup. It was the only available sacrament. "They don't know my name," he said low under the noise. Not a complaint, a discovery. The discovery, she watched it land at last all the way down, into whatever bedrock he had. "They don't know my name, and they're not cheering they're cheering the work?" Holt, just the work. It counts the same no matter who. He stopped. He looked at the soup, the town, the standing bridge, her. "It counts the same." "Welcome to the river," Marin said. The county engineer's report filed in triplicate that spring, credited Hollis B&C rigging crew, Supervisor M. Holt, and noted, in the dry tense of reports, that the Keystone lift method was not found in any current manual. In the margin of the work's own copy, in handwriting so fine it looked engraved, someone had added, "Page 41 strikes again." The report hangs in the Union Hall now, framed next to a photograph of a derrick barge in floodlights, and if you look closely at the figure on the ice, you can see he is exactly where the load isn't going to be, because he always was. But that was the winter. That was before the road came. The second time the lie nearly died, it came up the road exactly the way she'd promised him it would, wearing a buyer's coat. In the first week of March, asking polite questions about steel. The visitor's credentials said Vale, procurement agent, Meridian registered, interested in bridge sections for an off-world concession. The credentials were excellent. Too excellent, the way the new boots had been too new. Marin walked the visitor down the fabrication line herself, because the front office was at a regional meeting, and because something about the agent, S-spine made her want eyes on the situation. Vale was vairish, female, gray-banded, compact as a winch, and she inspected the welds like someone who had never bought steel in her life, but had perhaps inspected a great many honor guards. It went wrong at the rigging loft. It went wrong because Venn came down the loft stairs with an inspection clipboard, saw the visitor, and stopped, and the visitor saw him. What happened next took under 2 seconds, and to anyone who hadn't spent a season watching Ari Venn learn the world, it would have looked like nothing at all. The agent's whole body began a motion, heels drawing together, spine unlocking, right fist starting up toward the center of her chest, the same precise involuntary gesture Marin had seen on a clinic table in October, and Venn killed it with a look. One fractional turn of his head, no. The agent's fist came up and scratched her collarbone instead, badly, like a person remembering insects exist. The agent turned back to the weld with shaking composure and praised its penetration profile in a voice one half-tone too high. Venn walked past them both, nodded, "Ma'am, boss," and went out the loft door into the yard unhurried. A rigger about a rigger's business, except that Marin had seen his eyes, and his eyes were the eyes from the gravel margin. Doing load path math on a disaster already in motion, she gave it an hour. Then she found him on the riverside of Shed 4 alone, ostensibly inspecting slings, actually standing very still and watching the water the way men watch a thing they're about to lose. "Procurement agents don't salute hull laborers." She said. "No," he said, "they don't. Is she here to take you back?" "She is here," he said carefully, "because someone has finally narrowed 10,000 ports to a short list, and because she is loyal to me in a way her duty does not cover. I think she came ahead of her own report, to see if it was true, to give me," the careful voice flexed under the strain of honesty, "a running start." The river ran, the yard hummed and clanged behind them. 40 feet up Shed 4's wall, a faded sign her grandmother had painted said, "All loads have a path." "Know it before the load does." "How long?" Marin asked. "Weeks, perhaps a season, if she files the report she intends to file, which will be false, which will end a career she gave 30 years to." He looked down at his hands, the smooth hands that had learned fences and shackles and how to lose at cards. "Holt, it is becoming expensive for other people, what I'm doing, her career. Your paperwork." OC's silence. "Pavek thinks an angel works the rigging crew. Myrick tells the tavern he trained me. Every one of them is holding a corner of something they can't see the size of, and when it comes down, and you taught me this, all loads come down, it lands on the yard, on you." The gold rings came up. Tell me to get on a boat tonight and I will. It would be the responsible lift. Swing the load away from the crew. And there it was. The out, offered the way he offered everything, correctly, carefully, at his own total expense. One word and the strangest, finest thing that had ever come through her queue would vanish downriver. And the works would be safe from whatever was coming up the road. And lunch on the rail ties would be soup and silence for the rest of her working life. Maren Holt looked at the sign her grandmother painted. She thought about loads and paths, about what the yard could carry and what she could, about the autumn dance and the palm flat on the coat and the cost of every Tuesday she had left. No, she said, Holt, you flagged the risk. I'm the supervisor. I'm telling you the lift proceeds. Her voice held. Her hands she kept in her pockets, out of respect for their opinion. But you're done lying to me by Friday, Ven. Not to the yard. To the yard you can be whatever keeps them safe. That's triage and I'll hold that corner. By Friday I want the name under the green chit, the whole load, every ton of it, because I can't plan a lift blind. And here the supervisor ran out and the rest of her finished the sentence. And because you know exactly what you are to me, and a woman my age doesn't buy steel without the mill certificate. For the first time since the queue, she saw him entirely fail to be careful. The look that crossed his face was young, undefended, almost frightened, hope, ruinous hope. The one cargo he'd never learned to carry, and his answer came out half a breath too fast. Friday, he said. Both lunches, the whole load. Neither of them got Friday. On Thursday morning, the Meridian delegation arrived a season early, and the road up from the river held 3 vehicles instead of 1, and the third flew a small gray pennant that no one in Dunlow recognized, and Ari Venn, watching from the gantry rail with a clipboard going still in his hands, recognized it instantly, because the last time he had seen that pennant it had flown above his own betrothal contract, waiting, like the rest of his life, for a signature. The front office met the delegation at the gate with the desperation of a yard that knew exactly what was being decided. Maren met them with a hard hat in each hand and her grandmother's rule in her teeth, never let money walk a yard unescorted. There were 6 of them. 4 were what she expected. Meridian assessors with tablets and the bright, pitiless courtesy of people paid to compare. The 5th was a Karsk maritime liaison, present under some clause of bid fairness, wearing the small smile of a man whose yard was newer than yours. And the 6th, who had come in the 3rd vehicle under the gray pennant, was introduced by the lead assessor with a fractional drop in volume, the way you mention weather you can't control. And observing today by arrangement with the consortium's off-world partners, Heir Sena Mirath, of the Brel Compact. The heiress was tall even for the Vairish-adjacent peoples of the Brel worlds, slate-skinned, amber-eyed, dressed in something that managed to be both a plain travel coat and obviously worth more than a crane. She looked exhausted in a way that wealth usually paid to hide, and she surveyed the gantry line not like a buyer and not like money, but like a woman cataloging one more place she was obligated to be. Maren disliked her instantly, then immediately distrusted the instinct, which had nothing to report except that the woman's pennant had turned the best rigger on the river to stone. The compact is co-financing the Tidegate works, the lead assessor explained as they walked the line. 40% of the steel basket. The Heiress's house holds the shipping concession either way. Her presence is a formality of diligence. Then let's show her some, Maren said. The assessment was everything she'd feared and nothing she couldn't fight. The Meridian tablets counted her crane availability against Karsk's automated line and made small, fatal ticks. The Karsk liaison asked, twice with great politeness, about the average age of the workforce, and meant the average age of the cranes, or possibly the reverse. The insult was efficient and covered both. By mid-morning the arithmetic was visibly running against the works, and everyone on the yard floor knew it the way crews know everything, instantly, through the skin. The demonstration lift was scheduled for noon. It was the front office's idea of theater. Greta swinging a full bridge truss section from fabrication to the barge basin. A 140-ton ballet to prove the old yard's arm was still strong. Maren had built the lift plan herself 2 days earlier, before the schedule moved, before the wind did. Because the wind, with its genius for history, was coming up the Ketteridge out of the southwest exactly as it had on the 14th of October, and the plan on her clipboard had been written for a different day. She ran the arithmetic at the basin edge with the delegation watching, and the morning's small, fatal ticks stacked on her shoulders. Inside limits, barely. Defensible. The kind of margin she'd accepted 100 times against it. A postponement, in front of the assessor's tablets, in front of Karsk's small smile, an old yard publicly declining the exact kind of lift the Tide Gates were made of. Decades of work, 206 names on the rolls, and the deciding pen hovering right there, at the basin, in the wind. Boss. Venn was at her shoulder with the rigging crew, voice pitched for her alone. He'd been silent all morning, had worked the far side of the line, kept steel between himself and the gray pennant with a casualness that fooled everyone but her. Now his eyes weren't on the heiress at all. They were on the truss and the crane, and the brown river air doing its arithmetic above the basin. Ask me what I see. 15 years of being asked what's the call. Nobody asked her what she saw. Tell me. Your plan is sound for the wind you wrote it for. This wind is gusting through the truss webbing. It's a sail with holes in it, and the holes make it worse, not better. The gust loading comes in pulses, and the pulse period is close to the swing period of 140 tons on Greta's fall. The cutlery voice, laying it out like place settings. Inside limits on paper. But the paper averages the wind, and the wind has stopped averaging. If a pulse catches the swing twice in rhythm, the load walks. Nothing you can tag down. I've watched this river all winter, Holt. It's October again. Only bigger. And if I postpone in front of those tablets, the yard loses the contract and dies in 18 months. You're telling me to swing the load away from the crew. Same words I'll use at the funerals. No. And here he stepped around into her sight line, deliberate, the way he never did in front of the yard, and she saw something kindle behind the gold rings that she had no name for yet, though 40 worlds did. I'm telling you the plan is wrong, not the lift. Re-rig it. 2-crane tandem. Greta takes the main fall. The basin crane takes a stabilizing line through a snatch block. Here, his finger drew it on her clipboard. Fast, exact. A load path appearing like a thing remembered rather than invented. And we bridle truss at 4 points instead of 2, with the bridle angle killing the sail effect. The pulse can't find a rhythm because the system's period changes with 2 cranes sharing. It's not in your manual. Page 41 is wrong anyway. She looked at the sketch. 20 years of feel checked it line by line it held. Elegant, conservative, strange, like nothing on the river. And underneath all of it, the question she didn't have time for. Where does a man learn tandem rigging that isn't in any manual on this world? Time to re-rig? 40 minutes with Demel's crew. The tide gives you 50. Marin straightened and became, for the benefit of every watching tablet, the supervisor. Demel, re-rig for tandem, 4-point bridle, then runs the geometry. Gentlemen. To the assessors, pleasantly, with her grandmother in her spine, you're about to see why bidders who average the wind cost clients' gates. Take notes. The lift, when it went, was the finest thing the river had seen in a generation. 2 cranes breathing together like one animal. 140 tons of truss crossing the basin dead level, through a gusting crosswind, steady as a sentence being read aloud. The load settling onto the barge blocks with a touch so soft the assessor's instruments had to confirm contact had occurred. The yard crews didn't cheer, yards don't, but 200 pairs of hands found a reason to pause, and the silence was a standing ovation. Marin allowed herself one look at the delegation. The tablets had stopped ticking. The Karsk liaison's smile had gone administrative, and the Heir Center Athmirath was not looking at the load at all. She was looking at the rigger who had run the geometry, at the set of his shoulders against the crane light, at the precise unconscious, drilled from birth way he stood when a thing he commanded was carried out well. And her amber eyes were wide, and her gloved hand had risen, slowly, halfway to her mouth. Marin saw the recognition arrive the way she'd seen the girder arrive in October, a mass already in motion, nothing to do but watch the arc. The heiress took one step toward the rigging crew, then turned, knowing, of course he knew, he'd been doing this load path math all morning, and for a long, suspended pulse the two of them faced each other across 30 feet of basin apron. The woman whose betrothal pennant had crossed half the galaxy, and the man whose signature it was still waiting for. Then Heir Center of the Brel Compact closed her hand, lowered it, and turned to Marin and said in flawless carrying standard, "Your yard lifts like a court dances, supervisor. Better, in fact. Courts only pretend the wind isn't blowing." A pause, one judged half-second. "I find I have seen everything I came to see. My report to the consortium will reflect it." And she walked back toward the vehicles, the gray pennant snapping, and Marin understood 3 things in the space of a breath. That the heiress had recognized him absolutely. That the heiress had, for reasons of her own, just declined to detonate the only secret on the river worth a war, and that they now stood inside a countdown that someone else was holding. That night, the 3rd near miss came for the lie through the front door of the Anchor Tavern, where half the shift was celebrating, because that is how it always comes, through the television over the bar. It came as a news item between the weather and the football. The Veyrish Accord, off-world partner in the Tidegate Consortium, announcing through diplomatic channels a renewed search for Prince Eric's Velkoran, second heir of the sovereign matriarch, absent from court. The broadcast said, traveling privately with the heroic dishonesty of palaces for nearly a year, as the Accord and the Brel Compact prepared to celebrate the long-delayed sealing of the Meridian Truce. And on the screen for 9 full seconds, A portrait, ceremonial dress, formal banding, paint across the jaw, gold-ringed eyes staring out of the stiff, decorative, retouched mask of state portraiture. The tavern's noise dipped, considered, and resumed. All looked the same in the paint, the big ones. Somebody said comfortably. Pavic squinted, said, "Looks a bit like our cathedral. If our cathedral ever ironed anything." And the table laughed and the football came on and the world, incredibly, went back to its beer. Marin did not laugh. She was watching the corner table, where Ariven sat with his one slow beer, looking up at his own face on the television with an expression she finally, fully recognized because she'd seen it on men standing under a suspended load in the bad yards, the ones that walked under it daily until they forgot what it was. Not fear of falling, habit of weight. He set down the beer and looked at her across the tavern, and she saw him understand that she knew that the portrait and the geometry and the bones and the salute, the heiress's risen hand had finished assembling themselves in her, that the load path had completed, that the last person on the river he'd wanted standing under the truth was standing directly beneath it. She picked up her coat and walked out into the March cold, and he followed her, as she knew he would, and they stood by the river wall in the dark between two streetlights, in the wind that had stopped averaging. "Say it," she said. "Friday came early. My name's is Eric's Velkoren." Quietly, evenly, each word set down and then left there, unretrieved. Second heir of the Vayrish Accord, the arrangement I told you of. The signature is a marriage. Mine to the Heir Sena Mireth, contracted when I was 9 years old, to seal the truce that ended the Meridian War. The war killed 100 million people, Holt, on worlds you'll never see. The truce is held for 20 years on the promise of that wedding, renewed and delayed and renewed, while the Compact's hardliners and ours sharpen their accounting and wait to be insulted. I am not a man avoiding an awkward engagement. I am a clause in a peace treaty trying to learn fences. A breath, careful even now. 11 weeks before you found me in your queue, the date was fixed at last. And I looked down the whole length of my life. Every room I would stand in, every word I would be handed to say, every person who would ever look at me and see the clause, and I tore up my own pennant and I ran. Not from her. She is trapped in the same contract. She has her own river somewhere, I expect, that she never got to choose. From being a signature. From marrying as a document and dying without ever once being. The careful voice went to its knees, without once being wanted as a fact, as a man. By anyone, ever, even one time where it counted nothing and cost nothing and meant everything. That is the whole load, Marin. Now you know what's been hanging over your yard all winter. The river ran black under the wall. Her own voice came out low and even, the voice she used over a live radio with a load swinging. And the customs queue, the fence, the Tuesdays. Was any of it? It was the only true year of my life. Fast, low, wholly uncareful, his hand coming up between them, not touching her, stopping short, a man flagging what he didn't know. Everything before this river was the lie, Holt. You met the first true thing I ever made. You taught most of it to me. She looked up at him, from the television with all the state paint scrubbed off. The face she'd watched learn the world from a paint bucket. And the thing in her chest was enormous and without a chart. And what she said was, the Harris recognized you. At the basin. She walked away from it, but she's one report from ending the truce. Your guard captain's one audit from a treason charge. And your face was just on my television, son. The road's not coming anymore. It's here. I know. Then you also know I have 206 names on my rolls in a yard your consortium is deciding the future of, and a peace treaty's worth of empire about to land on my basin apron looking for its claws. Supervisor's arithmetic said with a supervisor's steadiness, while the rest of her stood by the river wall screaming, "What's the lift, Ven? What do we do?" And the second heir of the Vayrish Accord, the finest rigger on the river, the man who saw load paths before loads moved, looked at her in the dark and for the first time since the queue had no geometry to offer. "I don't know," he said. "For a year I've had one plan, be no one somewhere true for as long as the sky allowed. The sky's done allowing. Everything from here is a wind I've never rigged for." They were still standing there, a careful arm's length of March air between them, when the sky to the southwest began, very quietly, to fill with lights that were not stars and did not move like aircraft, descending in perfect formation toward the river, and the wind brought them, faint and getting louder, the sound the whole town would remember for the rest of its life. The choir and warning hum of a Vayrish sovereign escort making planetfall. "They always come up the road," Marin said softly. "Should have watched the sky." The escort did not land in the town. That, Marin learned later, was itself a message, drafted and argued over light years. 3 ships of the sovereign matriarch's own flight set down in the river meadows 2 miles south of the works, on land hastily and retroactively leased through the consulate, so that no one could ever write that the Accord had occupied a human town. Empires apologize in geometry. The fourth ship, smaller knife gray without ornament, came up the Ketteridge at first light, slow, 10 feet above the water like a barge made of weather, and moored itself off the outfitting basin with a courtesy that emptied every shed in the yard. Anyway, Marin stood on the basin apron with 206 names at her back, in front of the gates of her grandmother's yard, and watched the ramp come down. She had expected soldiers. She got first, a single figure in a gray-banded coat. Captain Vial, procurement agent no longer. Walking down the ramp with her spine unlocked at last and her career visibly in ashes behind her, who crossed the apron to where Ven stood. He had refused flatly to wait anywhere but the open yard among the crews, in his work coat, and stopped the regulation 3 paces away, and brought her fist to the center of her chest with 30 years of drill behind it, and held it there. "My prince," she said in standard, deliberately, publicly, so the whole river could hear the words she had spent a season not saying. "Forgive me. I filed the true report. They had my second's family. I am sorry for the running start." "You bought me a winter, Captain," Ven said. "It was the finest debt of my life." Then the soldiers, then the heralds, then a personage Marin would later know as First Minister of Dask, Chamberlain of the sovereign matriarch's household, a tall, dry varish of advanced years with banding gone slate pale and a voice like documents being filed, who unrolled, physically unrolled, in the wind on a basin apron smelling of weld smoke and river mud, a summons naming HFY, Corin, second heir of the Accord, recalled to the side of the sovereign matriarch for the completion of the Meridian Accord and the sealing of contracts long deferred. The yard crews stood in a silent crescent through all of it, hard hats in hands, watching their rigor be claimed by an empire. It was Mirek, of course it was Mirek, who broke protocol on behalf of the human species. "He's got 4 slings flagged for inspection in the loft," Mirek announced loudly to no one and everyone in the tone of a man citing scripture. "Whoever he is, paperwork doesn't care." Something moved through the crews, not laughter, harder than laughter, a settling. And Marin watched her yard, her stubborn, underpaid, magnificent yard, perform without rehearsal the only miracle she'd ever needed from them. Faced with a prince, they declined to see one. They saw a rigor with open inspections. The thing his whole life had been starved of, 200 laborers handed him for free, in front of the Chamberlain of the Accord, as casually as passing the salt. The First Minister's gaze traveled over the crescent of crews, the rust-streaked gantries, the supervisor standing at their head, and a lifetime of court showed Marin exactly how this looked from the ramp. The heir of the Accord, discovered shamefully employed in a decaying industrial concern on a peripheral human river, contaminated by mud and wage labor and proximity to her. The summons re-rolled itself with a snap. "Highness," Dask said, "the matriarch's ship sails on the noontide of this world. We will, of course, compensate this facility for its disruption." "You will not," Ven said. He said it pleasantly, in the cutlery voice, and the temperature on the apron dropped anyway. He turned to face the crews and Marin saw him take a breath and become, with visible cost, like a man shouldering a load he had set down for 1 year of his life. The other thing. The shoulders changed. The voice changed. It gained rooms and history and the particular weight of words that move fleets. The yard saw their cathedral become an actual cathedral, and even Mirek went still. "My name is HFY Corin," he said to them. "Everything else I told you was as true as I could afford. I came here to learn what I weighed without the crown, and you weighed me honestly, by my slings and my paint and my card playing, which, to Pavek, we will speak of, because the debt was real even if the losing was theater. I will not insult this yard with compensation. A yard is compensated in one currency." He turned back, and the gold rings found the First Minister. "Work, fairly bid and fairly judged. See that nothing about the last hour touches the tide gate assessment in either direction, First Minister. If the works wins, it wins as a yard, not as a souvenir of my disgrace." "Adventure," Das corrected smoothly with diplomatic horror, "has nonetheless ended, Highness. The Heiress Marath has been gracious beyond all contract. The matriarch waits, the truce waits. 100 million dead wait to stay dead. It was brutal, and it was meant to be, and it worked the way only the truth works." Marin watched it land on him, the whole arithmetic of empire, the wind he'd never rigged for. 2 systems worth of hardliners waiting to be insulted. A piece balanced on a wedding, a clause being recalled to its document. He crossed the apron to her. The crews pretended as one organism to study the river. Up close his face was the clinic table face, fear contained and well-bred, and over it terribly the habit of weight resuming. "This is the part," he said quietly, "where I learned what I should have rigged for. They cannot make me sign. But if I refuse from here, from a foreign river, from beside you, the Compact's hardliners call it an insult arranged by Earth, and yours becomes the species that broke the Meridian truce. The load lands on your yard either way, Holt. It always lands on the yard. A breath. I go to make it land on me instead." That is the responsible lift. You taught me that one too. I taught you the load chart, Marin said. Her voice stayed level, which she would bill someone for eventually. I also taught you page 41. The book can be wrong, Ven. The book the whole river certifies by can be wrong, and the man who proves it isn't arrogant. He's the only one doing the reading. She held his eyes. Don't sign. Marin, that's the supervisor's call. You asked what I see. I see a tandem lift nobody's drawn yet, because everyone keeps averaging the wind. 2 empires, 1 war, 1 wedding, that's 2-point rigging on a load that's been walking for 20 years. Find the 4-point bridle. You're the only one in any of their rooms who's ever actually stood under steel. Her hands were in her pockets, out of respect for their opinion. And when you find it, come back and tell me the whole load, both lunches, like you promised. Friday never came, Ven. I'm carrying it as deferred, not canceled. For a moment, the man in front of her was neither rigger nor heir, but simply nakedly someone being seen, wanted as a fact, where it counted nothing and cost nothing and meant everything. And he received it the way the truss had settled on the blocks, with a touch too soft for instruments. Deferred, he said, on my line and my name, which you now have, both of them. Then the empire folded him into its gray geometry and took him up the river and into the sky, and the work stood in its own silence. And Marin Holt walked back to the shift office, closed the door, sat down at her desk, and discovered that the morning's roster was still open on her screen, with the rigging crew 1 name long, and that there are kinds of arithmetic no supervisor is ever trained for. What followed was 5 weeks of the strangest season in the river's memory. The story broke planet-wide inside a day. Prince worked incognito at River Yard, and Dunlow filled with journalists who interviewed anything that held still. The Yard closed ranks with magnificent unhelpfulness. Merritt gave 9 separate interviews consisting entirely of paint specifications. Demal told a network anchor on a live feed that she didn't discuss former crew with people who walked under suspended booms, which was unanswerable because the anchor could not determine whether anything was suspended above him. Osi cited confidentiality. Pavek wept, usefully, about angels and was deemed unbroadcastable. Marin said he flagged defective stock and his inspections were current, and said it 40 times to every camera identically until the cameras gave up and decided the human angle was a dry hole. Only one journalist, sharper than the rest, asked the real question. Supervisor Holt, would you hire him back? And Marin, live level, looking down the lens at a point 400 light years past it. His locker's not reassigned. It wasn't. That was true. It sat there in the rigging loft with Ari Ven stenciled on it in her own yard paint, and she could neither reassign it nor walk past it without her chest doing unsupervised things. And the whole loft knew it, and nobody said one word, because yards know everything and say nothing. It's why they outlast empires. The news from off-world came in tides, garbled by distance and diplomacy. The heir restored to court. The matriarch's pleasure officially boundless. Her actual sentiments sealed. The sealing of the Meridian Accord, scheduled at last with a date and a venue, 6 weeks out aboard the matriarch's flagship, in neutral orbit above Earth. That detail the analysts chewed for days. A courtesy to the wronged human partner world, said some. A leash measured to the prince's last known sympathy, said others, and Marin turned the radio off. Then the tide started running wrong. Week 3, the Brel Compact's senior negotiator replaced overnight, the new one a hardliner from the war generation. Week 4, a compact squadron conducting scheduled exercises, 2 systems from the Accord border. An Accord squadron developing a sudden need to survey the same volume. The financial feeds, Marin had learned to read them that winter the way she read wind, showed war risk premiums on Meridian shipping lanes ticking up, small fatal ticks. Something inside the sealed negotiations was walking, like a load in a gusting wind, and the only rigger who'd ever know what to do about it was the one locked inside the document. And in week 5 on a wet Tuesday, a consulate car came down the yard road, and a Vairish woman in an unmarked gray coat stood in the shift office doorway dripping politely, and Marin looked up from the load charts into the amber eyes of Heir Senamirith of the Brel Compact, unannounced, unescorted, and visibly, dangerously tired of geometry. Supervisor Holt, the heiress said, I require a lesson in rigging. I'm told you take students. Marin put down her pen. My last one caused complications. Your last one, Senamirith said, is about to refuse to sign the Meridian Accord in front of both empires with no plan, no allies in either delegation, and no idea that I know because the only true thing in that entire orbiting mausoleum of a negotiation is the look on his face when anyone mentions this river. He is going to stand up in that hall and be magnificently suicidally honest, and the war generation on both sides will get the insult they have been sharpening their accounts for, and 100 million dead will get company. The heiress stepped into the office and closed the door on the rain. Unless the 2 people the treaty never consulted, the bride it traded, And the woman its groom actually chose rigged the load differently first. I have a ship, supervisor. I have 6 days. The shipping concession of a great house and a lifetime of being a clause in other people's documents, which I have just decided to stop being. Amber eyes steady as a flame in still air, he found his river. I am here about mine. Will you come, or do I learn tandem lifting alone? Marin had run a yard through 3 owners and 2 recessions. She knew a real offer from theater the way she knew live load from dead. She also knew that the woman in her doorway was the single most dangerous ally on 2 sides of a war line, and the only person in either empire with standing to walk Marin Holt into the room where the load was. Sit down, she said. Drip on the chair, not the charts. And start from the actual beginning, because I plan no lift blind. The actual beginning, it turned out, was 2 children. A boy of 9 on a Vairish garden world, told at breakfast that the war was over and that he was the price. A girl of 11 in a Brel orbital hall, presented with a portrait and a clause on the same tray. They had met 4 times in 20 years, always in rooms shaped like documents, always surrounded by professionals of the truce, and had developed across those 4 meetings the strange, starved solidarity of 2 hostages who cannot speak freely but recognize the rope burns. I do not love him, Senna said, without heat. I have never been permitted to know him well enough to try, which is its own answer. What I feel for Eric's Velkorin is what one prisoner feels for another when the escape rumor turns out to be true. He got over the wall, supervisor. 11 months he was out. Do you know what that did in certain rooms? Not the scandal, the hope. My own cousin started asking why the truce still needs a wedding that neither party will attend except under guard. The hardliners heard the question being asked. That is why the date finally moved after 20 years. They are not closing a celebration. They are closing a door he proved was open, and the wrongness in the negotiations, the squadrons, the premiums. First Minister Dask and my delegation's new principal, Marshal Korath, despise each other with the tenderness of men who need each other professionally. Dask needs the wedding sealed to retire as the architect of peace. Korath needs it to fail. Provocatively, insultingly, in a way attributable to the Accord, because the Compact's war generation believes a second war, now, while they hold the shipbuilding advantage, ends with better borders than the first. The wedding is the only object in the room they both want intact, each as a different kind of trophy, and the groom is planning to set fire to it in front of everyone. Senna's amber eyes didn't blink enough. It was, Marin was learning, the Brel tell for exhaustion. He thinks honesty is a plan. He learned that here, I suspect. I have come to learn what else you taught him, in hopes it includes arithmetic. Marin got up, went to the drawer where she kept things that could end the world, and took out a folder she had been filling for 5 weeks without admitting to herself what it was for. Financial feeds annotated. The Tidegate Consortium structure, mapped in her own hand, Meridian's 40%, the Brel shipping concession, the Accord's steel basket. War risk premiums, Karsk's automated line and its single fatal dependency she'd found in week 4, the one every analyst had missed because every analyst averaged the wind. Then let's talk about what a wedding is actually for, she said, because I've sat through the union negotiations of 2 recessions, and I have never once seen a deal that survived on sentiment hold, or a deal that survived on interest fail. Your truce was rigged 2-point from the start. 1 wedding, 1 war, the whole load swinging on whether 2 strangers sign. 20 years of everyone watching the hook, and nobody checking the load path. She spread the folder open on the desk between them. So tell me, Heiris, and take your time, because the answer is the bridal. What does the Brel Compact actually want that a marriage was standing in for? And what does the Accord actually fear that a hostage was insuring against? Because we are going to find the 4 points, you and I, and then we are going to walk into that orbiting mausoleum and re-rig a peace treaty in front of 2 empires, and the only thing I require, Marin's voice stayed perfectly level, is that the groom doesn't find out the plan requires him to stand up first. He gets his honest refusal, he's earned it. We just make sure that when he lets go of the load, something is already holding it. Senna Mirith looked at the folder, and then at the supervisor for a long moment of recalculation, the way the customs officer had once looked at a laminate that was about to be believed. He didn't fall in love with kindness at all, she said slowly. The journalists all assume a warm human heart, a humble refuge. They have it wrong, don't they? He fell in love with competence. In this yard, Marin said, they're the same trade now. Shipping concessions, talk. They worked for 2 days in the shift office with the rain on the windows, and what came out of it, Marin privately labeled, in her own shorthand, in the corner of the folder where front offices never look, the tandem lift. It had 4 points like any honest bridal. Point 1. The Tidegate contract, and through it the template. Earth's consortium needed gates. The compact held shipping. The Accord held alloy steel. A standing tripartite industrial compact, Gates now, then the Aldermouth follow-ons, then the orbital dock refits both empires had deferred through 20 years of armed peace, bound the three economies at the keel where wars become unaffordable. Interest, not sentiment. Senna's house could deliver the compact's commercial bloc, who had spent 2 decades watching war risk premiums eat their margins. Point 2, the hostage problem solved with honest collateral. The truce had used 2 children as security deposits. Replace them with the thing both empires actually valued, the Joint Fleet Escrow Senna designed at Marin's desk in one furious wet afternoon. Warship construction on both sides capped and mutually crewed Varish officers on Brel hulls and the reverse, so that any war began with each fleet decapitating itself. The military version of a tandem lift, Senna said with the first real smile of the visit. The system's period changes because 2 cranes share the load. He'll recognize the geometry. He'll know who drew it. Point 3, Korath. You don't argue a hardliner out of his war. You take away its venue. Karsk's automated line, the compact war party's quiet darling, the yard their analysts touted as proof the next war's logistics belonged to them, ran its entire fabrication schedule through a single proprietary control architecture, licensed, Marin had discovered in week 4, from a Brel firm owned 2 shells deep by Senna's own house. If my house publicly reprices that license against war risk, Senna said, reading the annotation, his shipbuilding advantage develops a margin call. It wasn't a threat anyone would ever speak aloud. It was a folder that would simply be visible in the right briefcase, in the right room. Loads you never lift, Marin's grandmother used to say, still count. The other bidder learns the crane exists. Point 4, and this one Marin wrote alone, at night after Senna had gone to the consulate, because it cost her the most. The clause about the clauses. Both heirs released from the marriage contract, by name and forever. The release written into the new Accord's preamble as a founding principle and not a concession, that the peace of the meridian rests on the interests of the living and not the bodies of the unconsulted. Words to that effect. Words, actually, that she typed and deleted 4 times before settling, at 2 in the morning in the shift office with the river running black, outside on the version she could defend to any union hall on the planet. No treaty shall hold a person as security. People are not collateral. Sign your own names. She looked at it a long time. It freed him. That was the point of the whole bridal. It freed him into a life with an empire in it, a court, a duty, a sky-wide horizon of rooms she would never enter. And nothing in any clause obliged him to carry a deferred Friday back down to a river yard on a peripheral human world. The lift was honest. Honest lifts don't guarantee where the load lands. They guarantee only that nobody dies of the swinging. Sign your own names, Marin said aloud to the empty office and filed the folder and went home and did not sleep. The matriarch's flagship was called, the heralds rendered it carefully, Patience of Mountains, and it hung in high orbit like a city that had decided gravity was a regional custom. Marin rode up on a Brel consular shuttle with Senna, an annotated folder, 1 borrowed formal coat, and the human delegation's credentials Senna's house had arranged, technical advisor, Tidegate Consortium, which had the advantage of being perfectly true. She had expected to feel small. She felt instead professionally irritated, which steadied her. The shuttle bay's load markings were ceremonial rather than rated. The honor guard stood inside a crane slew radius that wasn't flagged, and the whole vast golden-gray architecture of Empire had the unmistakable texture of a facility where the people who knew didn't decide, and the people who decided didn't know. It was, she thought, the biggest front office in the universe. She'd been fighting that building her whole life. It was just usually smaller. Whatever happens in the hall, Senna murmured as they walked the embarkation gallery, do not speak until the geometry is on the table. A human voice, too early, is Korath's gift. Foreign meddling, the insult arrived. Your folder speaks first through my delegation's commercial block. You speak only if the load walks, Marin said. I've worked demonstration days before, Hyrus. They came around the last turn of the gallery, into the staging antechamber, where both delegations mustered beneath banners that had glared at each other across 20 years of armed peace, and the room's noise dipped, considered, and died, because crossing the antechamber from the Accord side, in formal banding paint and the full gray weight of state, flanked by First Minister Dask and a wall of protocol, came the second heir of the Varish Accord. He saw her. Of course he saw her. He had seen a girder's arc before the girder chose it. He saw her in one pass of the gold-ringed eyes, technical advisor's badge and borrowed coat and folder under her arm, standing beside his own contracted bride at the heart of the mausoleum he was planning to burn down with honesty, and Marin watched, across 40 feet of imperial marble, The careful cutlery of his composure clatter, one piece against the floor of him. His step broke. Half a beat. The habit of weight caught it, restored it, carried him on. To every court eye in the antechamber, nothing. The air, walking. But his hand, at his side, had closed. Around nothing. Around exactly the shape of a clipboard's edge. And Marin knew the way she knew when that the man had gone. In one heartbeat, from a clause awaiting execution to a rigger doing load path math on a basin he suddenly, against every arithmetic of empire, did not recognize. Good. She thought level as a live radio.
Eyes up, Ven. Watch what two cranes can do.
They came for her credentials within the hour. She had been promised they would. Senna had war-gamed the whole approach on the shuttle, move by move, like a woman who had spent her life being moved, and still it had a chill to it when it arrived. 2 officers of the Accord's protocol service, exquisitely courteous, regretting that the technical advisor's accreditation required supplementary review, which was court for a small room and a long wait while the ceremony happened without her. Behind the officers, at the end of the gallery, First Minister Dask watched with the placid attention of a man feeding documents into a shredder. The review is irregular, Senna began, with the full frost of a great house, but Marin put a hand on her arm because she had seen something the heiress hadn't. The third figure walking up the gallery behind the protocol officers, compact as a winch, in the dress grays of the matriarch's own flight, with 30 years of drill in her spine and a fresh insignia at her collar that hadn't been there at a rigging loft in March. "Stand down," said Captain Vile to the protocol officers pleasantly. "The advisor's credentials were reviewed at the highest level this morning. I conducted the review. It found that she is exactly who she claims to be, which will make her." And here the gold-flecked eyes came to Marin with something that was almost a smile. "The only person at the table of whom that is true. The sovereign matriarch requests the advisor's presence. Now." Alone, the protocols melted. Dask, at the end of the gallery, performed the small bow of a man rescheduling a murder and was gone. "You filed a false report for him once," Marin said quietly as Vile walked her into the gold and gray deeps of the ship. "It cost you your career." "It cost me a career," Vile said. Her sovereignty takes the view that an officer who will burn 30 years for the truth of a person is wasted on procurement. A turn, a lift, a corridor where the honor guard wore the iron gray of a household older than nations. She also takes views on supervisors. You are about to experience one. A word of crewmanship, human to human if you'll have it. Do not manage her. She has been managed by experts for a century, and she eats them. The matriarch received her not in a throne room but in a chart room. Marin registered that, filed it, revised several estimates. A working space of dark metal and projected stars. The meridian border drawn across the ceiling in lines of old light. Every disputed system flagged in 2 colors of grief. Yzain Velcorin stood under it like a foreman under a load schedule, small iron-banded, alone, and did not waste either of their remaining decades on preamble. Supervisor Holt. "My grandson believes he is going to destroy this ceremony in approximately 2 hours, magnificently on principle alone. My First Minister believes he has just isolated the only witness who could make the destruction respectable. The Compact's Marshal believes his war is finally arriving. The heiress believes something is in your folder." The ancient eyes were the same gold-ringed black as her grandson's, gone deep as the chart light. "I have read 11 months of reports on you, including a clinic scan that does not officially exist, and 1 sentence of yours that my analysts cannot stop quoting. His locker is not reassigned. Tell me then, you who flag liars for a living, and tell me straight, because I have perhaps an hour of patience left in my reign. What is my grandson worth?" And Marin Holt, 400 light-years up her own river, in a chart room with the most dangerous grandmother in 2 empires, heard the question under the question. The one a customs queue had asked, the one the whole galaxy kept asking with its scanners and its summonses and its clauses, and declined supervisor to answer it in the empire's currency. "Wrong question, ma'am. That's the question that put a 9-year-old's name in a treaty." She held the old eyes, which was like holding a load line in a gust, and kept her hands out of her pockets, where they wanted to go. 20 years ago, somebody asked what he was worth. And the answer came back, 1 war. So that's what he grew up as, currency. And currency has one property, ma'am. It only matters when it's spent. He spent his whole life waiting to be spent. The border burned overhead in 2 colors. The question I'd ask, if I were running this yard, is the one I ask about every man on my rolls. Not what is he worth, what does he carry? Because I can tell you that to the pound. I've watched it for a year. He carries more than any soul I've ever certified. And he carries it where the load is, every time, without being ordered, under a name that got him nothing. You want to seal a peace tonight? Marin nodded up at the ceiling of grief. Stop trying to spend him and start letting him carry. He's not your treasure, ma'am. He's your best crane. And it is a crime against the whole river, she said in exactly the voice she used on owners, to melt down a crane for coin. Silence in the chart room with the stars turning. Vial at the door had stopped breathing in any way that was audible. Then the sovereign matriarch of the Virish Accord said, slowly, with a century of court in the words and something else entirely underneath them. They told me you taught him load charts. They did not tell me whose chart you'd be reading when you arrived. She turned toward the door, toward the ceremony, toward the last 2 hours of the old world, and gathered her iron the way Marin had watched the grandson gather his on a basin. Apron. Go to your gallery supervisor, keep your folder ready, and understand one thing as you stand there, because I will deny it before any committee in the Accord. The old voice for one word was just a grandmother's. Hold. Whatever happens in that hall, whatever it costs in fleets or face, I did not moor this ship over your world to watch him sign. The Hall of the Accord aboard the Patience of Mountains had been built for exactly one purpose, 20 years deferred. A kilometer-long vault of gray and gold, the treaty table at its heart like an altar, and above the table Marin's breath went, just for a moment, when she saw it. The original Meridian Truce itself, the armistice document, suspended in a stasis field 50 feet over the signatories' heads. Suspended, over everyone. 20 years. Your whole civilization, she murmured to Senna, walks under one load. Now you understand the negotiations, Senna said, and went to her delegation. The sovereign matriarch of the Virish Accord entered last, and the hall did not so much fall silent as remember it had always been silent and apologized for the interlude. Isaine Velcorin was small for her line, a compact iron-banded woman of immense age, who walked without escort precisely because no one within a light year would have survived being a reason she needed one, and she took her place at the head of the treaty table with a glance that inventoried the entire hall in one pass and priced it. Marin, standing in the technical gallery with the human consortium delegation, watched the matriarch's gaze cross her grandson, pause for the dozenth of a second that constitutes, in a face like that, an outburst, and move on. The old woman knew something, at least. Knew the boy who had torn up his pennant and run to a river was standing at her treaty table with his weight on the balls of his feet like dockside labor, and that nothing about today was going to follow the Herald's script. Knew and had come anyway, and had allowed the venue to orbit Earth. She's not closing a door, Marin thought suddenly, watching the iron profile. She's watching the wind. She's been watching it longer than any of them. The ceremony of sealing had 20 years of choreography and took an hour to reach the only sentence that mattered. Recitations, honors. The war dead of both empires read by category, the numbers so large they stopped being grief and became geology. Marshal Korath spoke for the Compact's delegation, a wide gray-frosted veteran with a voice like a hull plate, who praised the truce in the past tense throughout, a tense error so consistent it was a manifesto. First Minister Dask answered with the future perfect, the tense of architects. Will have been sealed, will have been secured. The two tenses circled the table like rival cranes above one load, and above it all, in its field, the old armistice hung 50 feet up, turning at the rate of a slow clock. Then the keeper of accords called the parties to the instrument of completion, and read the marriage clause aloud, and 1,000 people heard her invite Arix Velcorin, second heir of the accord, to step forward and sign. He stepped forward. The hall leaned in, a single organism. Marin's hands were in her pockets. He looked at the instrument on the table for a long moment, the groomed, illuminated, 20 years awaited page, and then he did the thing that she would hold in her chest for the rest of her life, through everything that came after. He looked up 50 feet at the suspended armistice overhead with the precise assessing flick of a man checking a load above a work zone, old stock, flagged in September. And then he turned around and faced two empires and did not pick up the pen, and the sound the hall made was the sound of the tagline snapping. Before I refuse, he said conversationally into the stunned vault, the cutlery voice, set down word by word, the acoustics of state carrying it to the doors, and I am going to refuse. I want the record to hold that no one in this hall was ambushed by it. I ask the keeper's indulgence for one question of the parties. 20 years ago, 100 million dead bought one document, and that document hangs over this table because both empires agreed it must never again rest its weight on the ground. Since then, the entire architecture of the peace has hung from exactly 2 points, a wedding and the fear of losing it. He let that stand. Korath had gone very still. Dask had gone the color of his banding. I have spent 11 months learning, from people none of you will ever outrank, what happens to a load rigged from 2 points in a gusting wind. So my question, to the marshal who keeps speaking of the truce in the past tense, and the minister who keeps speaking of it in the future, and the two empires who have spent 20 years watching the hook instead of the load, my question is, who here has checked the rigging? The rigging, Marshal Korath said into the silence, with the satisfaction of a man watching his counterparty default, is two signatures, Highness, one of which you are publicly withholding, from a treaty table in orbit above the world, where you went absent without leave from your own dynasty. The compact came to seal a peace. It appears instead to have been summoned to witness an abdication of it. The war generation of my worlds will hear that the Accord's heir standing above Earth declined. The compact's commercial block, said Senamireth, rising, crests the floor. What followed, Marin would always remember as the demonstration lift. Except that this time she stood in the gallery while the geometry she'd drawn, at a wet desk on the Ketteridge, went up under someone else's flawless hands. Senna spoke for 11 minutes without a note. The tripartite industrial compact, gates to docks, laid out clause by clause with the shipping figures, lived behind her on the hall's displays. Interest, not sentiment, and Marin watched the commercial delegations of two empires sit forward in a single movement, like crews hearing the lunch whistle. The fleet escrow, warships mutually crewed, each navy holding the other's keel, the military version of a tandem lift, and she said those words. The system's period changes when two cranes share the load, looking once briefly at the heir of the Accord, who received the geometry like a man being handed back his own heart, redrawn in a finer hand. And then, without ever raising her voice, the visible folder. The compact's fabrication advantage repriced against war risk. Her house's licensing position, laid open on the table with the mildness of an auditor noting the time. Nobody threatened anyone. Korath read the figures, and Marin watched a war lose its venue in real time. Watched the past tense drain out of his posture line by line until what remained was a veteran of the last war looking at the actual price of the next one, in a hall above a world that built storm gates. And the final article, Senna said, the preamble of the new instrument. I yield its reading to its author, the technical advisor to the Tidegate Consortium, without whom none of this architecture exists. Amber eyes found the gallery. Supervisor, the load is walking. You said you'd speak if it walked. 40 years on a river. 2 recessions, 3 owners, 206 names. Marin Holt came down the gallery stair onto the marble of empire in a borrowed coat, and the hall's 1,000 faces did what halls do, priced her, dismissed her, recalculated as she kept coming, and she reached the treaty table and put one annotated folder down on 20 years of illumination and looked at not one single person except the sovereign matriarch of the Vairish Accord, eye to ancient eye, supervisor to supervisor. Ma'am, everything in that folder holds whether or not anyone in this hall ever loves anyone. That's the point of it. It's rigging. It's meant to carry weather, not depend on it. She heard her own voice level out into the radio register, a live load swinging somewhere always. But I came up here from the yard where your grandson worked a winter, so before I read you the article, you'll get the mill certificate, because nobody should buy steel without it. For 11 months I watched the man your heralds call a clause. I watched him learn offense from a foreman who hates everybody and flag bad stock nobody else had read and put his back, his actual spine. Ma'am, I have the clinic record, between 60 tons of steel and a man whose name your treaty will never know. I watched him give away his overtime so quietly it took me a month of watching to catch the arithmetic, and the whole of it, every shift under a false name. Now, where I work, that's the only test of a man that can't be rigged, what he does when his name isn't on it. She let the hall have one breath of silence. She'd learned that from demonstration days, too. Your empire spent 20 years arguing about what signature is worth. I'm the only person in this hall who's seen what he's worth without it. And the answer is, more than both your fleets, because fleets don't hold in a crosswind unless someone like him reads the rigging. Her hand flattened on the folder. So here's the article, and then I'm done. No treaty shall hold a person as security. People are not collateral. Sign your own names. The silence that followed had a grain to it, like planed wood, 1,000 courtiers discovering that the thing in their chests had a load rating. After all, Marin stood in it, hands back in her pockets, and watched the sovereign matriarch of the Vairish Accord look from the folder to her grandson, and watched the iron face do at last what faces do, even at empire scale, even after a century of state. It aged backward one instant into a grandmother who had read a torn-up message many times. Do not look for me. And had looked anyway, and had moored her flagship over this one particular world, and had allowed all of this, every clause of it, to walk up her treaty table and ask. 20 years, Usain Velcorin said, into the hall, her first words of the session. We kept a document in the air because we feared what it would mean to set it down. The ancient eyes went up, 50 feet, to the armistice turning in its field. We were never preserving the peace. We were refusing to test it. A thing you cannot set down is not a treaty. It is a suspended load, and my engineer is correct. The gaze came back to Marin, dry as filed documents, and 1 degree warm beneath. The wind has stopped averaging. Keeper, strike the marriage clause. Enter the tripartite instrument and the escrow articles for ratification by the parties. And write the supervisor's preamble at the head, in the old script, exactly as spoken, beginning with, "No treaty shall hold a person as security." Because my grandson once sent me a message I have carried for a year, and I should like the 2 texts to be filed, the old woman said, in the same archive. What the historians would call the Second Meridian Accord took 4 more hours of clause-by-clause combat, and Marin stood through every minute of it at the technical advisor's rail, answering exactly 3 questions about gate steel logistics and watching 2 empires re-rig themselves around interest, mutual decapitation, and 1 sentence typed at 2 in the morning in a shift office above a black river. Marshal Korath signed for the compact with the heavy, unhurried hand of a man who had recalculated the borders of the possible and found the new ones survivable. Dask signed in the future perfect and managed in the end to stand quite near the architecture as though he had drawn it. Senna Mirith signed her own name, her own by name and forever, party of the first part to her own life, and when she straightened from the table, the look she sent across the hall to the Accord's heir was the one prisoner's look, over the wall at last, both of them in opposite directions free. And at the end, under the old armistice, which the keeper's crews on the matriarch's order were already preparing to lower, 50 feet gently, onto a cradle of honor at the table's center, where it could finally bear witness instead of wait. The second heir of the Vairish Accord took up the pen at last and signed the instrument that released him, and set the pen down and asked his sovereign, in the formal register, before 2 empires and the lowered banners of the war dead, for the floor. "It is yours," the matriarch said. "It has, I think, been yours since the noon recess." "I have a request of the Accord," Eric's Velcorin said, "and a debt to declare on the record." The gold-ringed eyes crossed the hall, found the technical advisor's rail and stayed there, and the careful voice, for the second time since a customs queue, for the second time in his life, went entirely uncareful in public. The request, that the Accord's permanent legation to the Tidegate Works be established at Dunlow on the Ketteridge River, and that I be assigned to it, not as heir. The escrow articles need an engineer inspector with standing in both fleets, and I am the only officer of rank in either empire holding current certification in human heavy rigging. A pause. The certification is under another name, which is the debt. Keeper, let the record show that whatever I have done in this hall today, I learned the load chart from Supervisor Marin Holt of Hollis Bridge and Crane, who taught me that the book the whole river certifies by can be wrong, that honest lifts don't guarantee where the load lands, and that there is a kind of standing no crown confers, which is the standing you have with the people who have seen you work. The fist came up, drilled from birth, and pressed flat to the center of his chest, but he was not facing his matriarch when he did it. "On my line and both my names, the debt is acknowledged and I am going home to pay it. Friday, Supervisor, deferred, never canceled. 2 empires, 1,000 courtiers, the lowered armistice, and the iron amusement of a sovereign matriarch all turned as one organism to see what the human woman at the rail would say to that." Marin Holt looked across the hall of the Accord at the finest rigger on her river and gave the only answer the yard had ever taught her and the only one she had ever needed. "Bring a better lunch," she said. The Hall of 2 Empires did not know what the sentence meant and rippled with the unease of courts everywhere when something true is said in front of them. The sovereign matriarch, who had governed for a century precisely because she always knew which sentence in a room was the real treaty, inclined her head 1 degree toward the human at the rail and adjourned the session. It should have ended there, cleanly, like a load on blocks. It did not because nothing involving empires ends cleanly. It ends in committees. The legation request spent 5 weeks in protocol. There were factions at court. There would always be factions at court, for whom an heir of the blood, serving as an engineer inspector on a human, river was a humiliation to be fought clause by clause. And First Minister Dask, robbed of his architect's retirement, fought it with the meticulous spite of a man footnoting his own obituary. Marin followed the battle from 400 light-years downwind, through Senna's dry dispatches, and learned more than she wanted to know about how the other yard worked. The matriarch let the factions exhaust themselves, in the way of old supervisors everywhere, and then settled the matter in a single session with one ruling, the text of which Senna sent verbatim. The Accord has spent 20 years insisting its honor hung from a single thread. The supervisor's preamble is now our law. People are not collateral. My grandson's standing is not a thread, and the Accord that survives setting down the armistice will survive setting down its vanity. He has requested work he is qualified for, in a place that judged him correctly before we did. Request granted. The legation sails with the Gates deal. And in the same 5 weeks, the other decision came down. The one Marin had carried in her desk drawer through everything. The Tide Gate Award. The assessor's report ran to 900 pages, and the deciding passage, the one the front office framed and hung in the entry hall where the queue could read it, ran to 3 sentences. Karsk Maritime's automated line offers superior throughput under nominal conditions. Hollis Bridge and Crane demonstrated superior judgment under actual ones. The Aldermouth Gates will spend a century in actual conditions. 206 names became 400 within the year, and the hiring queue at the Dunlow Intake Hall grew long again for the first time since her grandmother's day, and on a bright, hard morning in early summer, Marin Holt stood at the rail of the waiting pen with a clipboard on her hip, reading the line the way you read a load chart, and found it changed and the same. The nervous ones, the veterans, the liars. A city of cranes waking up behind her, the river running brown and patient, the way it would run when all of them were filed and forgotten. At the head of the queue, the customs officer took a fresh set of documents through the slot, read them once, read them twice, and looked up and up at the applicant. Purpose of entry? Permanent residence and employment, said the tall Varish in the worn gray work coat, the same coat. He had kept the coat, and the boots were old now, and the hands holding the papers loosely, easily, were a rigger's hands, scarred at the knuckles, with paint in the creases that never quite leaves. I'm expected at Hollis Bridge and Crane. There's also. The gold-ringed eyes came up over the officer's head and found her at the rail, and held, with the whole queue between them and the morning light coming down through the high windows like something rated for the load. A deferred appointment, long-standing. The officer studied the laminate. It says here, you read it as written, please. The officer read it as written. Erix Velkoren, Engineer Inspector, Accord Legation to the Tidegate Works, Certified, Human Heavy Rigging, Regional Board. Real name, real trade, real papers at last, 400 light years of bureaucracy vouching, this time, for the truth. The stamp came down twice, like a heartbeat. The green chit slid through the slot with no lie clipped to it at all. Next, the officer said. He came through the pen gate with one kit bag, and the queue watched the supervisor of the biggest works on the river meet him at the rail, and those nearest heard the exchange and retold it for years in the Anchor in the Union Hall, getting it slightly more wrong each decade, the way rivers polish stones. Papers, Marin said. He handed them over. She read them with professional slowness, there in the noise of the hall. This man who had crossed 2 empires and rewritten one to stand in her queue under his own name, and she came to the line she had been told about, the one Senna had flagged in her last dispatch with a single annotation. His clause. Fought for it personally, 3 committees. The line in the legation charter that fixed his posting's duration, where treaties customarily wrote, for a term of years, or, at the pleasure of the sovereign, the instrument of the Second Meridian Accord in the matter of its engineer inspector said, for the working life of the Aldermouth Gates. A century. The Gates would outlive them both. It was, by several committees' worth of fighting, the longest posting in the diplomatic history of 2 empires, and it was a sentence that meant, in the formal register of a court she'd stood in once in a borrowed coat, I am not visiting, I am not collecting anything, I am staying on this river until the river is done with me. These appear to be in order, Marin said when she could. They had better be. I have it on the highest authority that the supervisor here flags liars in the corner of her intake sheet. He took the papers back, and his voice did the thing it only ever did for her, set down its careful weight entirely. Marin, it's Friday. It's Tuesday, actually. It is the deferred Friday. I checked the ledger. From the kit bag with ceremony, he produced lunch. 2 correct lunches from the shop by the bridge, and 1 whole raw onion, prominently displayed, because the man had learned the human arts in the right order. Sentiment last, and therefore truest. The whole load, supervisor, every ton. Some of it is heavy, and one piece of it I'll ask you to take in both hands, because where I come from, you give it standing in front of witnesses. He didn't kneel. Yards don't, and he had learned everything from Yards. He simply held out, on his open palm, in front of the customs queue and the officers in the morning, a plain steel ring, yard steel she'd learned, off-cut from the first Aldermouth Gate plate, turned on Merrick's own lathe, by hands that had once never carried anything for themselves, and asked her the question with no geometry to it at all, the one no-load chart anywhere covers. You told me once there was a whole man underneath, he said. You watched him learn a fence. Marry him, the intake hall of the Dunlow River port was not silent. Intake halls never are. Somewhere a stamp came down on someone else's life twice like a heartbeat, But the queue had gone very quiet, and the river ran outside, brown and patient, and Marin Holt, 42 years old, supervisor of the yard that built the gates that would hold back the sea for 100 years, looked at the truest thing that had ever come up her queue and found that her hands had finally come out of her pockets, and that they were steady. "On my line and my name," she said, and took the ring in both hands, the way you give a thing standing. They were married at the end of summer, at the Union Hall, under the string lights, with the whole yard in attendance, and the fried dough smell coming in the windows. And if a certain consular shuttle was parked discreetly behind the feed store, and if the small iron-banded great-grandmother of an empire sat in the fourth row in a plain gray coat, having moored the patience of mountains out past the orbital line under a merchant flag, well, Dunlo had learned to keep its empires to itself, and the yard's only comment was Myrex, who looked at the most powerful being in 40 systems eating fried dough off a paper plate at a folding table and said she could come on the paint gang, she had the wrists for it, and was not vaporized, and in fact got a second plate brought to her by an honor guard who had been specifically ordered to learn how. Senna Mirith stood witness on the bride's side, at Marin's asking, which the heralds of two empires never did work out how to file. Damal stood on the groom's, and called him the cathedral in her toast, and finally, 20 months too late and 3 drinks in, explained it. Because the first week, I watch him stand under Greta, looking up, and I think, that's not a man checking a crane. That's a man in the place he prays. And when the dancing started, the band was bad, the speakers were worse. The night was perfect. The engineer inspector of the Second Meridian Accord crossed the floor to his wife, with the studied air of a man who had once watched this done from beside a cider table, learning it, and held out his hand correctly, carefully. "I've been practicing," he said. 4 committees worth. "Show your work," said Marin Velkarin, and the yard roared, and he did. The gates went up over the following decade, one by one, at the Aldermouth, the largest moving steel structures on the continent, and they are there now, holding back the sea in actual conditions, inspected every season of their working lives by a tall figure in a worn gray coat, who walks the high steel without a harness to the despair of every safety officer on 2 worlds, and who signs every inspection in a hand so fine it looks engraved. The treaty that has his wife's sentence at the head of it has held longer now than the war it ended ever ran, and the historians who got nearly everything else wrong did get one thing right. They noticed that the piece of the meridian was the first in either empire's history rigged from 4 points instead of 2, and they traced the geometry, clause by clause, back to a shift office above a brown river, though they never did find out about the onion. The works runs 3 shifts now. The queue at the intake hall is long, and the supervisor is always a supervisor, the river insists, still reads it the old way. The nervous ones, the veterans, the liars. Her intake sheets, archived in the Union Hall, are studied by labor historians for their shorthand, and one mark in particular, in the corner where front offices never look, has been the subject of 2 doctoral theses, both wrong. It appears exactly once, on a sheet dated the 14th of June, against the name of a hull laborer, 3rd grade, out of Tesson Ring Station, and it is not an L. It is an L corrected, years later in a different ink, by a steady hand that had finally weighed the whole load. The falsified papers and flagged stock, the spine put between steel and a stranger, the overtime lost at cards, the empire rebuilt around one honest sentence, the century-long posting, the ring of gate steel, and had written, beside the old mark and the space the years had kept open for it, the only verdict the yard ever cared about, the one no crown confers and no court can file. True as written, hired for life. Because that was the thing he had crossed half the galaxy in a customs queue to find out, and the thing the river had known since the morning his boots were too new. That a man's worth is not what is stamped on him, but what he does when his name isn't on it, and that somewhere, if he is lucky beyond all arithmetic of empires, there is one person who will read him twice, flag the lie, watch the work, and choose the whole man underneath. She did. He stayed. The river runs brown and patient past the both of them, and the cranes sing their 2-note song in the March wind, warning and choir at once, and they hear it the way they taught each other to hear it. Both, that's the job, hearing both.